I want to shift the conversation to nation state adoption because just yesterday we got the second country to announce Bitcoin as legal tender, Central African Republic. Um, Maybe we could start off with a reflection on the first, I guess, 9 months of El Salvador and their Bitcoin law. What was your opinion on it when it went into effect or when it was announced at Bitcoin 2021, and how has that evolved over time?
So I was positively surprised by the announcement. That's not something I would have guessed for 2021. It's kind of earlier in kind of Bitcoin's timeline than I would expect for something like that to start happening. I think it's favorable. I think it makes sense for them given how much remittances they have, and the fact that they're already dollarized. Uh, Also, there's first mover advantage because then you can bring in tourism, you can bring in investment activity, and things like that. So I think it made sense economically. Uh, the risks, the biggest risk I'm watching to that, there's two risks. One is that now Bitcoin is somewhat tied to the reputation of El Salvador's governance, whether it should be or not. It's just kind of, to whatever extent El Salvador stumbles, that gives media fuel to go on against Bitcoin, right? So they're somewhat tied at the hip now, to a limited extent. Number two, uh, for El Salvador specifically, so far, I think the biggest risks have been their sovereign bonds, right? So, for various reasons, including credit rating agency downgrades, things like that, their bond yield spiked, and so that makes it hard to refinance, and hard to get reasonable cost of capital, unless they can entirely change over their funding to say Bitcoiners, and Bitcoin-backed bonds and things like that. And so their success in, say, generating more tourism or more investment, types of activities can be somewhat offset by problems in their sovereign bond market. And so I think it still remains to be seen how successful that will be, but I do think it makes economic sense to have done what they did. And so, I'm cautiously optimistic on how that turns out for them.
And now that we have a second country jumping in as well, does that change the relationship between, like you mentioned, the close ties between El Salvador's success and Bitcoin success? Does that change now that there's a second nation involved? And did that open the doors for other nations to step up and also take a look at Bitcoin? Because I think the currency that the Central African Republic was using is also used by a handful of other countries in Africa. And so I wonder, do you think that opens the door to a handful of other countries to also participate?
So the short answer, I think, is yes. So one is that there are strength in numbers, right? So if there's one country with Bitcoin legal tender, they're an obvious target, because they go against the legacy system, and basically to whatever extent they succeed or fail, they people will tie Bitcoin's narrative to that. Whereas if you have 10 countries, using Bitcoin as legal tender, that's a very different story, right? And so that's a movement. Um, you know, this second one is, so it's smaller in the sense that El Salvador is a relatively impoverished country, uh, on the grand scheme of things, whereas this other one is extremely, extremely impoverished. I mean, it's a small fraction of El Salvador's GDP per capita. They have very low internet access, unlike El Salvador, where mobile phone, uh, access is pretty high. Uh, Central African Republic is very low. So I somewhat struggle to see that they're going to get anywhere near the benefit that El Salvador gets, but I think it's hard for it to hurt, right? I think that, to the extent that Bitcoin is legal tender, I think that's just good, right? I think it's just good for the economy. I just don't know. I think there's not a lot of information out of it yet, but I think a lot of it's symbolic, right? So as you pointed out, there are 14 countries in Africa that use this currency that's tied to France, and it's actually split into two chunks. So I think it's like 8 use one type and 6 use the other type. But essentially they're using this kind of French-run currency, and that has obvious, ties to colonialism, right? And so I think that I wouldn't be surprised to see other ones of those other 13 countries do something similar in the future. You can call it kind of a pushback, right? And so I wouldn't be surprised to see more countries in Latin America and more countries in Africa adopt Bitcoin legal tender. I think it's a good thing. I just think we have to be careful about how much we get enthused for, some of these early entrants, especially if it seems more symbolic than something that's going to maybe pay off in the next couple years.
Right. And I guess for the people in the Central African Republic, if I think I looked up GDP per capita is something like $800
Yeah.
per person, and I think El Salvador was like 3 or 4 thousand. So in a situation where you have people who may not be able to save money, and as you mentioned, may have low internet access, do you think it's realistic to expect Bitcoin to significantly improve their standing in life and their ability to kind of consume resources over time? How long is this process going to take? Like it it doesn't seem like there's a quick win for someone who doesn't have much income and doesn't have much internet access to benefit from what Bitcoin has to offer.
That's how I interpret it. Admittedly, I'm not an expert in that country and its details, right? So I'm always cautious to opine on things that I've just learned about. But yeah, basically my initial impressions are that with such low internet access and such extreme poverty, it is hard to get an immediate benefit out of it. Now, to the extent that someone has internet connection and now maybe didn't really wasn't paying attention to Bitcoin, but now because of this they pay attention to Bitcoin, they could potentially get work from abroad. They could earn sats in various ways that they might not have thought about a month ago, right? So I think that there certainly could be individual lives that are changed because of this. I just think that it would take time and more favorable conditions to see this really start to kind of take root and make any sort of change. And then again, the opposition, the political opposition in the country can then use that against them. They can say, okay, well, what is this for the top 1%? I mean, most of us don't even have internet connection. What is this? So yeah, it just opens up political challenges. But I think in the long run, it's favorable. I just don't know how it's going to materialize in the next couple years. We'll see.
Is it realistic to have like a central bank in one of these African countries step in and buy Bitcoin in the same way El Salvador did? Because now they have a reasonable amount of exposure. I think it's over 1,000 Bitcoin, and for a population of 6 million people. So if Bitcoin does succeed, there is some exposure in the country to benefit from that. It may not be directly at the individual level. So I guess, do you think there's a playbook here for small or developing countries to step in, buy Bitcoin, and kind of ride its coattails to improving the quality of life in the country?
So I think that any country leadership that becomes bullish on Bitcoin for one reason or another should seriously consider putting a non-zero amount, in their reserves. So it could be a sovereign wealth fund or it could be a central bank purchase, basically. And it doesn't have to be it's not like they have to go all in, right? I mean, it's a volatile asset. It'd be, these are supposed to be the safest pools of capital, right? So you generally don't allocate to things that go up and down 50% in a short period of time. But, I think around the margins, it would make total sense to have some, right? It's because you're buying in this disinflationary asset that has a very strong track record, and that I think that conditions are still looking very favorable for it for the next decade. And it also solves a second problem, which is permissionless payments. If for whatever reason that country is cut off from payment systems, they have an asset that they can send globally, for value to buy other things. And so I think that having a non-zero amount of Bitcoin, especially for these smaller countries that might have more flexibility, right? So, they have less career risk. They have less, they're kind of more able to take kind of Hail Mary type of plays to put a non-zero amount. I mean, if you put 5% of your central bank balance sheet in Bitcoin, what's the worst that could happen compared to the upside that can happen, right? So I do think it makes sense. I don't know if we'll see it, but I'd like to see it.